The Russia-Ukraine war is obviously a topic we cover here on the show quite a lot of times to always bring you the inside information and the truth about what's going on. And we usually keep it, talking about what different leaders say here and there. There's another aspect to this sometimes that gets kind of overlooked that actually ends up folding back into it. It's really kind of interesting the way some people are responding to this and I won't say the truths, but the narratives that they like to create for themselves. And it has some strange applications elsewhere. On Twitter last week, there was a very interesting exchange by Rebecca Heinrichs and Will Kane of who was on a Fox News podcast featuring David Sacks, whom we've had him on our show several times, and actually we're going to have him on here today to talk about some of this stuff. But we're going to get to that engagement in just a second. But first of all, I want to bring up David Sacks who is of PayPal fame, who's the co-founder of that, and currently is the co-founder and partner of Craft Ventures and the host of the All In podcast. So first of all, David, just welcome back. Glad to have you back here again today.
Yeah, good to see you, Danny.
And so let's just jump right into it, because when I first saw this, I just, at first my eyes just kind of rolled, but the more I got into it, the more I was like going, yeah, there's more here than meets the eye. And we need to be talking about this because I don't want to let some of these narratives that some people are casting on cast the light in a wrong direction, as opposed to the darkness where it needs to be put to bring the truth to light. So first of all, let me put that tweet back up there, Gary. So Rebecca, a very short tweet at first, she said, what a tragic disaster that this guy got a platform to otherwise thoughtful people. So Kane immediately responded to that, and his comment was, okay, instead of some BS about platforming something you disagree with, why don't you come and lay out your position? Which then she says, the country invading another nation, targeting its cities, targeting its missionaries while accusing them of being agents of the West and kidnapping children is the aggressor. It has nothing to do with agreeing or disagreeing with me on the wisdom of aid. Responsible people disagree. I thought that the comment was a little strange, David. And I want to ask your opinion of this exchange here, but so people can understand the context, here's a short clip of that exchange that you made on the Kane Show.
When you actually start to examine the case for Putin being an aggressor, it really falls apart. Now, in terms of the Russians wanting a sphere of influence in their backyard, I suppose that there's some truth to that, but that doesn't mean Russian domination of these countries in the manner of the Soviet Union. What was Russia looking for in Ukraine? They were looking for neutrality. They simply wanted Ukraine to remain neutral. And the deal that Ukraine could have made before the war or at Istanbul in the first month of the war is to officially declare neutrality, to say that it would not join NATO, and to respect the rights of the Russian speakers in the Donbass, give them the semi-autonomy that had already been agreed to by Ukraine under the Minsk agreements. And if Ukraine had done that, there would be no war today, and Ukraine would have lost no territory. But that was not good enough for the West. It was the West who came in via Boris Johnson and said, we want to pressure Putin, not make peace with him. And that's why the peace agreement at Istanbul was rejected. And that's why the war continues to rage to this day.
I think the only way that the phrase tragic disaster could be applied is not towards your commentary, which was very rational and laid out what had happened. But the one thing you said in there, this war could have been avoided and they wouldn't have lost any territory or people. That is the tragic disaster in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. But in their view, the tragic disaster is anyone trying to challenge this narrative they've created that this war was somehow necessary and that diplomacy wasn't an option. Their main narrative that undergirding all of this that you heard Speaker Johnson repeat and you've heard Biden repeat it's the Putler narrative that basically Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler. And the reason why that narrative is so important is, number one, if Putin is a threat on the order of Hitler, then we have to do everything we can to stop him. So it justifies endless appropriations for Ukraine, and potentially even more than that. But the second thing it does is it exculpates the West's refusal to engage in diplomacy. Because if Putin is really Hitler, then any diplomacy would be appeasement. We wouldn't be able to rely on that diplomacy anyway. I mean, Putin would surely violate it. So this is a twofold argument that they make with this, it's always 1938 type argument.
Right, right. It's always 1938. In fact, you can see an element of that. I was actually on with Rebecca Heinrichs a couple of weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago, and she may. Well, I'll just let you say it here. Watch what she says, and tell me if you pick out the really problematic part of this. Go ahead and roll this tape.
It's the first time that there's an attack launched from Iranian soil. I disagree that because the Iranians are operating in other places, including in consulates in Syria, that gives them immunity if they're the ones that are launching, funding, training the attacks that are constantly barraging Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself. And so there should be no sanctuary for where Iran is hiding its IRGC commanders and where they are. On the point about escalation, this administration, the Biden administration, has been almost obsessively concerned about escalation. But the way you deal with escalation is you turn to the adversary and convince the adversary not to escalate. You do not restrain your ally, because that just means that U.S. allies are in a losing position because the United States is shackling them. So I would say that the best way to deal with escalation is to fully back the Israelis, fully back Ukraine, fully back Taiwan, and tell these adversaries that really dislike the United States or are trying to undermine us, do not act aggressively against these sovereign people.
It's so simple, David. All we have to do is just tell all of our adversaries not to do anything, support everyone fully, to include Ukraine, and then they'll back down. What do you say to that?
Well, what she's basically arguing is that the way that you win a game of chicken is to put your foot down on the accelerator and then throw your steering wheel out the window. I mean, that's basically what she's saying. And, which is basically, we're just going to keep escalating, and then somehow we're going to persuade the other side not to escalate. Well, how do you persuade them? That doesn't make sense. I mean, we don't have any persuasive powers over the other side. The reality is that Russia is not going to be deterred here, because they view what's happening in Ukraine as existential for them. They just see it as a vital national interest. It's not a vital interest for us. It is for them. And as a result, we're going to lose the escalatory dominance here. As Obama himself pointed out back in 2014, Russia has escalatory dominance because this is something they're willing to fight and die for. And it's not something the U.S. is willing to fight and die for, we hope. And the Russians know this, and we know this. And so this idea that you can just bluff the Russians isn't going to work.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just counterintuitive and counterfactual, because Russia's shown that this is an all-out struggle for them. They've said it as much. I mean, they say it all the time. So I just don't understand the logic that says all we got to do is fully fund Ukraine, and that somehow, even though they've never done it, that Russia's going to suddenly back down. I don't even see the plausible path to success there, but yet they do seem to hold that pretty enthusiastically.
Well, this is the typical neocon argument, is that we're all powerful, and so therefore, if we will it, it will happen. There's no sense of constraints. There's no sense that the opponent might have a say in this equation. It's just a matter of us wholeheartedly supporting a given course of action, and it'll be successful. And of course, it's almost never successful. I mean, the neocon policy has been failing for at least 20 years. So if you just look at their track record, whenever they've made this type of argument, I mean, the argument is basically just, if we double and triple down, then we're finally going to win. But that didn't work in Afghanistan. It didn't work in Iraq. It hasn't worked in Syria. Over and over again, this argument that we can get out of this by doubling down has been proven false. But look, this is the classic neocon argument, is that when you're in a hole, keep digging, because maybe you'll reach the other side. I mean, that's basically the neocon argument.
So Rebecca there said, we need to fully fund Ukraine. Well, I don't know if we fully funded them, but at least we have, just passed this $61 billion spending package. And I'm going to talk about some of the details underneath that package in a second. But when it passed on the House of Representatives, I think it was Saturday, lots of flag waving folks that were on the ground there, and they were all saying, yay, this is cool for Ukraine on our floor, which was problematic to some. But it's interesting that all these folks who were supposed to be for America are waving their flags for Ukraine. And as this interesting fellow on Instagram here pointed out, that there's some curious discrepancies with how this is playing out. Check this out.
So if you vote to send our money abroad and you wave a foreign flag, you're an American patriot. But if you vote to keep our money at home and fund domestic priorities, you're a foreign agent. Clown world.
So I think you have some knowledge about this fellow, I believe, as you've told me.
Yeah, that's Johnny McEntee, who was Trump's body man in the last administration. And he happens to be a family friend. And he's quoting a tweet there that I tweeted out.
Yeah, and obviously that one short little clip there says so much, because that's this kind of stuff that resonates with regular people. We hear that and we're going, wait, what do you mean that's the case? But here's an example of one of the somebody who's, I will argue, very much disconnected from reality, but very well placed. Senator Richard Blumenthal went on television after this passed and said this.
You know, we're the strongest, greatest country in the history of the world. We can produce the kind of artillery shells, the long-range artillery, the ATACMs that are necessary, the air defense, Patriot systems. Iran needs many more of them to protect its cities. So we're building, and this measure, strongly bipartisan, I think sends a message. I think America is back on offense.
You know, that gets to a couple things. One, you just said, where there's no recognition of limits of power, so we can literally do anything we want to. He was specifically being asked there about his colleague, J.D. Vance, who had said there's a math problem, there's a physical constraint problem. And I actually found this from the Defense One, if you can bring that up there, Gary, that talks about what the issue is. It doesn't even matter how much money you get, especially in 155 millimeter shells. The best that we're going to come up with at the end of 2025, about a year and a half from now, is about 100,000 capacity. No matter how much money you throw at it, it's a physical capacity issue that we can't get there. And that's about a third of what Ukraine needs today. So flag waving aside, Blumenthal is just saying, because we're great, we can overcome these things. But as a businessman, I wonder if you can tell me, how do you overcome physical constraints to have an outcome that you desire?
Well, you don't, but that's in business. And if you try to violate laws of physics in business, you'll fail, and your company will go bankrupt. But there's no concept like that in Washington. I mean, they defy the rules of math all the time by continually, funding bigger and bigger deficits and a larger and larger national debt. So they have no constraints in Washington. I mean, even state and local governments are operating with a lot more constraints in Washington, because Washington has the world's reserve currency and they can simply print more dollars. So it's the simple fact is that the politicians in Washington have not been operating under logical constraints for a long time, and they just don't see any. But you're right on the artillery shells. I mean, this is something I've been following for a while. When the war began, the U.S. was producing about 14,000 shells a month. By the end of last year, the number that I saw publicly reported was 28,000. So you're now almost 2 years into the war, and you've only doubled your artillery production from 14 to 28,000, which is less than 1,000 shells a day. And we know that the Russians are using roughly 10,000 a day. So it gives you some sense of how off we are. And then, like you said, the announced plan is to roughly double this year. So to get from, call it 24 to 50,000. And then by the end of next year, to get from 50 to 100,000, which even if you do manage to get to, from 50 to 100,000, even if you do manage to get to 100,000 a month by the end of next year, that's 1.2 million. And the Russians are estimated to be at least 4 times more than that.
Right.
So even if we hit our targets, the Russians are still going to have a huge balance of artillery in their favor. I've seen estimates that the Russians are today at 3.5 million a year. So call it 350,000 a month. So, they're outproducing us by at least 7 to 1 right now. I mean, I do think that it is pretty amazing, actually, how slow we have been to ramp up these capabilities. It's really an indication of how deindustrialized America has become, how hollowed out our defense industrial base has become.
And isn't part of the reason for that, because I've often thought about this. I think if you look at this rationally, it's hard to say that Ukraine is going to be able to hang on. By my account and several others we've had on our show, that they think there's a better than a 50-50 odds that the Ukraine army will collapse before the end of the summer, much less going into the future. So if any businessman is looking at that and saying, should I invest a lot of money to expand my capacity so that in a year or so from now, wait a minute, the war might be over before I would even have anything done. So why would I want to risk that investment that can't pay off?
Yeah, I think what's amazing here is just that there was a strong desire on the part of the administration, and obviously there's a strong bipartisan majority in Congress to keep this war going and to fund the Ukrainians and give them the weapons they need. But the ability of the defense industrial base to produce these weapons, even more than 2 years into the war, just isn't there. And it's just a reflection of how degraded our DIB has become. I think what basically happened is that, I've done a little bit of research on this, is that in the 1990s, the Cold War ended, and we believed there would be a large peace dividend. And during the Clinton years, the Clinton administration officials told the defense industry, there were about 25 to 30 major contractors, that we're going to be reducing our capacity. We're going to take advantage of this peace dividend. And so you guys need to, reduce your capacity, and you should also try to merge. And at the end of that process, we had 5 major defense contractors, these so-called prime contractors. And I think what happened is this backfired because it created an oligopoly. And so we now had this oligopoly of defense contractors. And so they were able to raise prices every year. And the fact that the government works on this cost plus accounting means that every year the price of these weapons and ammunition just keeps going up. So we keep spending more and we get less for that. And after 30 years of this process, we're at the point where we can barely make artillery, and we certainly can't make it at scale.
Yeah.
We have a real problem here.
And this is not something, I don't know if you can speak to this a little bit, but it's not something you can just go, you know what? Yeah, we need more. Hey, put in an order and let's get this stuff out there. And then the industry itself, how hard is it for them to actually act on this, even if they wanted to?
Well, apparently the delay in scaling up artillery shells is that the government is that the existing plants where these shells are made are at full capacity. So you have to build new plants, which means the government has to bid out contracts, and then those companies win the contracts and they have to get entitlements, and they actually have to build the plant and do the hiring. And they need to be assured that this is actually a long-term contract if they're going to invest that kind of CapEx. Yeah. It can't just be a 1 or 2 year thing. So for all those reasons, this has taken a while. However, I would just say that there was a time when the United States could have gotten its act together and just moved way faster. I mean, look, if China was in this situation, do you think it would take them 2 years to double the amount of ammo that they're able to produce? My guess is they get 10 times the amount of ammo within 2 or 3 months. So somehow there's something about our system that has lost its agility. It's lost its scalability, and it's also, I think, lost any ability to be rational in terms of cost. One of the really interesting data points that's coming out during this war, this was in the New York Times, is that the cost to the United States of producing an artillery shell is somewhere in the $5,000 to $6,000 range, whereas the Russians are able to do it for $600. So it literally costs us 10 times the amount to produce a single shell than it does the Russians. Now, I remember at the beginning of this war that we were told that Russia was this corrupt kleptocracy and that their military base, would fail because there'd be so much theft and corruption that, the oligarchs would just steal everything. Well, as it turns out, our DIB is 10 times more inefficient than theirs. So what does that tell us about the level of corruption and kleptocracy in our system?
Yeah, that's not a good number, and that should be really alarming. Unfortunately, I doubt anybody's even going to notice it because most of the people on the Hill just care about passing money. And
Yeah.
and speaking of that issue, I want to ask your thoughts here, because before we came on the air, you said you had some thoughts about why Secretary Johnson actually changed his mind about this, because earlier in this process, he was pretty much against even bringing the bill to the floor, was worried about the border, but then all of a sudden that went away. The border never came back, but the money did. So I wonder if you can share with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so there was a widespread negative reaction, and certainly among Republican voters to what happened. I mean, in a way, it was good to see that the base of the party is still very much against this type of funding, and there were howls of outrage and a lot of accusations of betrayal and dark rumors that somehow that Johnson was being blackmailed or something like that. I don't think that's what's going on. I actually think that there's three big reasons why the House Republicans ultimately went along with this. Number one is donors. Number two is presidential politics. And the third one is just ideology or narrative. So on the donors, I have it on pretty good authority that some of the biggest donors to the Congressional Leadership Fund, which funds all of the House races, have made it pretty clear that they supported this bill and that they would not contribute to House races if Speaker Johnson didn't support this legislation coming to the floor. We're talking about donors who can write, checks, in the tens of millions or even $100 million plus type range. And I don't know exactly why they're
That was
so
what I was going to ask. Why?
hell bent and beholden on this, but I think it mostly comes down to the narrative, I think, or ideology. I think it's less about what's in it for them and more about their view of the world and their ideology. And that kind of brings me to point number two. On the narrative, even though Speaker Johnson had, as a backbencher, opposed a Ukraine funding bill, if you listen to that interview he did with Sean Hannity when he first became speaker, he pretty much repeated this whole Putler narrative, the idea that we have to stop Putin in Ukraine because if we don't, he's going to march on all of Europe. I mean, that idea has been out there for several months. And I think that whatever you think of Speaker Johnson, he doesn't seem like an insincere person to me. I actually think he believes this narrative. I think, or I guess you could say he's fallen for this narrative. And I think the donors believe it too. And then I think the third aspect of this is presidential politics. According to Johnson and according to Lindsey Graham, Trump gave his blessing for this bill, which I don't view so much as Trump in his heart of hearts supporting it. It's more that this is not the hill for Trump to die on. I think that, I think that what's going on there in terms of the presidential politics is that if Ukraine collapses in the next 6 months, Trump doesn't want to get blamed. He doesn't want to allow Biden to get off the hook by saying that, well, this is all because the Republicans wouldn't appropriate more money.
Yeah.
And so I think just tactically, I think that's a lot of what's going on here is that by fully funding Biden's request for the $61 billion, Trump has made sure that Biden now fully owns whatever happens in Ukraine before the election. And if there is a collapse, Biden can't say it's because of those obstinate Republicans who cut, our allies off at their knees. I think a lot of this might just be tactical, that no one wants to be on the hook for a Ukraine collapse.
But I had been talking about this before, that so many of the administration officials, I think some of them were hoping it wouldn't pass because they were already going, especially Kirby was going out of his way to say, the only reason why Ukraine is failing right now is because Congress won't do their job and get this funding bill off the package, implying that if only this money had been given, they wouldn't have been losing on the battlefield right now. But now you're suggesting also that maybe they're still going to use that and say, well, if you had given it to us earlier, maybe that would have helped.
That's the latest narrative that you're seeing right now, is that they're already creating a contingency plan, sort of a narrative contingency plan, which is they're already saying that it's not clear that the new $61 billion appropriation is going to work because it came too late, that the Republicans wasted too much time. Now, this narrative is nonsense, because I think that over the past 6 months, they've still been providing whatever weapons we've been able to produce. And the problem has not been a lack of wanting to give the Ukrainians weapons. It's just been that we haven't produced enough, but they've been getting whatever we've been producing. And you saw you saw that there was this article in Politico about how the administration gave Ukraine ATACMS a couple of months ago quietly. So that's just an example of how the
Couple
aid.
months ago, right before anything was passed.
Yeah, exactly. So they've been providing these weapons under the old authorization. It's continued. Moreover, there's been a number of reports that this 61 billion pays down a bunch of IOUs. It brings some accounts, that were in arrears. It pays them back. And so it's pretty clear that the administration did not cut off. There was no reduction in weapon shipments to Ukraine over the past 6 months. We gave them whatever we could give them. It's just that the limitation was on what we could produce.
Yeah.
But these guys need to create an alibi for themselves because they're starting to realize that Ukraine is doomed. By the way, I mean, the argument that you and Mearsheimer were making in that debate and the argument that J.D. Vance was making on the Senate floor against further funding of the war is that this was a doomed cause. And at that time, the people disagreeing with you, whether it was in your debate or whether it was, McConnell disagreeing with J.D. Vance, it was, no, this is not a doomed cause. This 61 billion will save the day. And 1 week later, they're completely moving the goalposts and saying, well, the 61 billion may not save them. It's probably too late. It's like, well, wait a second. If you believe that, why'd you just appropriate the 61 billion? We should have saved that money.
Right.
So they're certainly not embarrassed to move the goalposts in a dime. I mean, that speech that McConnell gave on Wednesday was supposed to be a victory lap on that funding passing, and he already was using that as an opportunity not to take credit for, again, this the spending that would save Ukraine, but to again try and lay out this new narrative that's going to place the blame on Tucker Carlson or J.D. Vance,
Right.
for delaying the funding.
Yeah, and it's just so much nonsense. But I'm going to show you how, and all of our viewers, just how much nonsense that really is. How this actually was. It's not just that Mearsheimer and McGregor and myself and several others are saying this. There's a very practical reason, and I want to show you some of them here. Now, you're probably going to laugh a little bit when I bring this first one up here, because I know it's somebody that you've noticed a lot. But retired General Ben Hodges is coming out, and I think it's just the last couple of days, and is trying to put the best face on this funding package and still has hope for the future. Check this out.
This is not some charity giveaway to a country in Eastern Europe. This is about our strategic interests. America's economy and our prosperity is directly tied to European prosperity, and you cannot be prosperous if there's a war and millions of refugees flowing in from Ukraine. Or if energy and food supplies are disrupted. And of course, it's in our interest that China sees that the United States and our allies are willing to do whatever it takes to protect international law, sovereignty, freedom of navigation. So this is very important. It's in our interest.
Because I have a hard time understanding how we get from passing 61 billion for Ukraine to freedom of international law and something about China. I don't really understand how that went along, but it's pretty odd to me.
Hodges is what we call a contra indicator in the stock picking business. It's kind of like, Jim Cramer picking stocks. It's except it's 180-degree opposite of whatever he says. But I'll tell you, he did have for maybe the first time in this war, he did have a fairly keen observation. He had a tweet that I actually retweeted where he noted that Biden, in the speech that he gave upon signing this new funding for Ukraine, Biden said that this will keep Ukraine in the fight. And what Hodges was wondering in his tweet was, why isn't he saying that Ukraine will win? Well, let me answer the question for you. The reason Biden is using the rhetoric of keep them in the fight, not helping them win, is because his people know that there's a very strong chance that facts on the ground will soon refute any claims about winning. And they don't want him to be too embarrassed by that. So, but of course, Hodges still thinks this thing is winnable.
Well, and now let me show you how much he thinks it's winnable. One of the issues that has always been raised out there is that if we go too far, especially if we get physically involved, then the thing could go nuclear. But Hodges has got something for you on that too.
Most of the reforms in Russian history always occurred after they lost a war, whether it was the Crimean War in the 19th century or the Russo-Japanese War or in the First World War, that's when reforms happened. And Russia is never going to change until they are defeated. So it's in our interest that Ukraine defeats Russia, and we should stop being scared of it. They are not going to use a nuclear weapon. There's no benefit for them to use a nuclear weapon.
So yeah, don't worry about nuclear war because they just won't do it because I don't want them to. So they're just not going to. Now, let me ask you before you comment on that.
Did you notice though that he said that Russia got reforms after losing World War I? I mean, what's he talking about? The Bolshevik Revolution? Is he saying that was? I mean, that's what he's talking about, right? He's saying that's positive reform. Anyway, just
right. Yeah, there's a lot of problems with that one here. I'm still locked on nuclear war because he's advising that the president shouldn't worry about that. But if you're thinking about whose advice to take, here's what Hodges said right before the summer offensive last year in 2023. And when he went out there to say, here's what he thought was going to happen, check this out.
The Ukrainian General Staff has done a very good job of preparing, I think, for this, what will be a counteroffensive when the conditions are set. That means weather, when the ground is dry, but mainly when they have done enough training and they have built up the logistics. And I think we're going to see an attack that will be very professional, very effective, and its purpose will be to, I believe, isolate Crimea and set the conditions for the eventual liberation of Crimea later this year.
Later this year. Just quickly before we go, I'd like to pick up on what you just said there, General Hodges, because you have, in general, been very optimistic about Ukraine's ability to repel the Russian invasion and even march on Crimea. Earlier, a couple of months ago, you said that you expected that to happen by summer. Do you stand by that?
Yeah, by the end of August, Ukraine will have been able to liberate Crimea if, and I've always included this caveat, if we provide them the long-range precision weapons that they need to do that. Yes, absolutely, they can do that.
So just before this offensive, he said they can liberate Crimea by August of that year as long as they get long-range missiles. Here's the thing, David. They got those long-range missiles. Gary, if you can bring that up there, with the British Storm Shadow missiles. Not that one, the other one, the other headline. We'll get to that one in just a second. They had the Storm Shadow missiles. They had long-range missiles. And of course, all they did was break their teeth on this. Now, I published 1 month after he did that, after he said that, and before the offensive began. Now, put that 1945 piece up there, Gary. I not that one. Yeah, there we go. I said that it won't work. It's not going to beat him. And I laid out all the detailed reasons why, which were, David, they were so easy to see. It wasn't hard as long as you just looked at the fundamentals that are out there, and all the things that I wrote about in there. It happened almost exactly the way I said. I actually gave the more possibility of Ukraine's success than what they ended up with. I gave him more credit. But for this guy to go on there as the three-star general who was in charge of all the American forces, army forces in Europe at one point, to say that they were going to succeed is just boggling my mind. Why no one ever calls him out on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I find genuinely scary is that he was our top commander in Europe, our top general in Europe for a number of years, and he's not right about anything. So, I mean, no wonder the U.S. hasn't won a war in 40 years, or I guess 30 years. But in any event, yeah, it's really bad. But look, there is no accountability with the media. That is the fundamental problem, is that they never call out the people who are wrong as long as they're all on narrative together. So they swim like a school of fish. And as long as you're a member of the school of fish, you can all be wrong, but no one's ever going to call you out. And it's amazing that he continues to get platformed by major media, to borrow the phrase from Ms. Heinrichs, is that the media is platforming the wrong people. But yeah, they're just keeping this whole narrative going.
Yeah, it's just anguishing to me to see, because as I think we've talked about before, the bill payers for this are the people of Ukraine. So this fiction that we keep having here, all this money is going to do is going to keep them on life support so that the war continues on and they keep dying. It won't change the outcome, but it will allow them to keep fighting a little longer, as opposed to if we didn't give the money and said we weren't going to. Now then they know, then they have to start closing up shop now and negotiating and getting the best deal they can, which would stop the killing and at least have a chance to bring this, war to a close on terms that would favor Moscow without question. But the longer you go, you're going to get a worse outcome later, I think, David.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been listening to what you and Professor Mearsheimer and others have been saying, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the best deal here for the Ukrainians would have been before the war for us to engage in diplomacy with the Russians and address their security concerns. They presented that draft agreement back in December of 2021. I mean, there were even opportunities before that at the Putin-Biden summit in the summer of 2021. But certainly by December of 2021, we could have negotiated in earnest to address their concerns. What were their primary concerns? Number one, they didn't want Ukraine becoming part of NATO, and number two, they had concerns about these dual-use missile systems that we had placed close to their border in Poland and Romania. I think we could have negotiated on those points.
Yeah.
And failing that, you had the Istanbul deal in the first month of the war that simply required that Ukraine become neutral and recognize the terms of the Minsk Accords. And if Ukraine had done that, they wouldn't have lost any territory. So yeah, I mean, it's the deal has only gotten worse for the Ukrainians, and the longer they wait, the worse it's going to get.
Yeah, and here's my growing concern is that that's the big bill payer right now. But if things keep going on and we keep getting these kind of nonsensical people in charge advocating things, I don't know if President Biden is going to actually act on any of these, but if he keeps getting this advice, it's troublesome. Here's one person that's not, I guess, blinded by all the spin, and that's Viktor Orban, and he's concerned also.
A NATO főtitkár NATO-ukrán missziót akar felállítani. Az európai vezetők már belesodródtak a háborúba, beszélek velük, hallom őket. A háborút a saját háborújuknak tekintik, és a saját háborújukként is vívják. De a helyzet nem javul, sőt egyre rosszabb. Egy lépésre vagyunk attól, hogy a nyugat katonákat küldjön Ukrajnába.
Now, as you know, there's thousands of U.S. forces in Romania and in Poland, and now then there's more advisors apparently going into the country. You've got Macron talking about maybe he'll send French troops in there. You have Poland saying that maybe they're going to send troops. And by the way, they want some nuclear weapons. And the UK is now operating, doing more operations on the border with Norway there, near Russia. And so they keep seeing all this stuff. And then I fear, David, that at some point, instead of accepting this physical defeat, which, like I say, could come in this summer, even if the Ukraine army collapses, that some may say, oh, we can't have that. We better send in some Western troops. I don't know if you recall it, but during that debate that Mearsheimer and I attended at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, one of the other advocates said, if that happens, we'll just send in NATO troops. I was shocked that she said that.
I mean, these people are fanatics, and I think this is the great risk right now, is that the West does not accept Ukraine's defeat. It wants to double down and send in troops, and we get into World War III. It sounds improbable or fantastical, but there's now a lot of people calling for this. I mean, like you mentioned, Macron is arguing for putting in ground troops, something like 20. He wants to put in something like 20,000 French and British troops. He thinks that somehow this will deter the Russians from taking Odessa or marching west of the Dnieper. And the problem with this is that once they're there, there's a very strong chance that they'll be killed or attacked by the Russians. The Russians have said that any troops in country will be a target, regardless of where they come from. And then Macron will come crying to the Americans to bail him out. And if you have a Biden second term where these people are just so deeply invested in this Ukraine policy, I mean, it's really the signature policy of the Biden administration so far. And it goes back even 10 years ago to when he was vice president. I mean, they are so passionately attached to this Ukrainian cause that I think there is some meaningful risk that they could be kind of lured into really Macron's trap. And it's not just Macron. I mean, you're now seeing it from, I think it was the Lithuanian foreign minister was repeating calls like this. And certainly there's no shortage of columnists in the European press who are advocating for this. So you're seeing more and more people. You know, what always happens is that when a suggestion like this is first made, it's roundly denounced and people say it's crazy, but then it becomes normalized. And you're at the phase now where people are openly advocating for this and it's no longer seen as crazy. So it's, only a short, hop, skip, and a jump to the point where the narrative could sort of shift in favor of doing something like this. Now, I don't think it will happen before the U.S. election, because I think that Biden knows this would be deeply unpopular.
That's exactly what I was about to ask you, though. But what if my scenario does play out and the Ukraine army collapses before that? As I had on a show earlier today, there's been a tactical breakthrough already at one level in west of Avdiivka. There's been a significant penetration of Russian forces pretty deep into the Ukraine section of the lines. We'll see if that develops further or not. It may or may not. But if overall they end up breaking before that, let's say in the halfway through the summer, so before the election, that's going to put Biden in a real problem, because if he just allows it to happen, I mean, that's going to almost, give a good chance that he's going to lose the election because he owns it, as you say. Then he might want to try to rectify that. How do you think that would happen? How do you think the electoral politics would impact if something like that happens this summer?
My read on the politics is that clearly Biden does not want Ukraine to collapse. I mean, that's what this whole hold and build strategy was all about, where they sent General Aguto to Kiev at the beginning of this year. That's what the 61 billion is all about. They're just trying to hold things together through the November election. But let's say that Ukraine does collapse this summer, they'll face a choice of whether they want to somehow bolster Ukraine, perhaps by sending in troops, or they'll just have to kind of memory hole it. And I think that my read of the politics is that sending in U.S. troops would be so unpopular before the election that they would rather just memory hole it. And what they'll do is they'll use the narrative they've already started creating, this like alibi narrative. They'll say that we did our best, but it was Republican delay for 6 months. That was the vital time period. And that's when the Ukrainians essentially fell too far behind, and we did everything we could, but it was those Republicans who are agents of Putin, who are working to help Putin, that caused this collapse. And they'll sort of memory hold the whole thing. I mean, they have narrative control, so I think they would rather do that before the election than send in U.S. troops. I think that after the election, though, it could be a different story.
Yeah, and it's ironic that you actually have one particularly noteworthy Republican that seems to be helping that narrative, which would benefit the Democratic side, and Lindsey Graham, because here's how he's putting this, and I'm sure you've seen this before.
If you give Putin Ukraine, he will not stop. This is not about containing NATO. And if you give him Ukraine, there goes Taiwan, because China's watching to see what we do.
It's a whole house of cards. Once one thing happens, I don't know why China would go to Taiwan, but apparently that they would. So, my God, we have to take action. That's this kind of, I guess the narrative just keeps getting out there in the mainstream media anyway, that makes people, I don't know, maybe come to the point where maybe we better do that.
Yeah, I mean, look, they have narrative control right now, and I think that certainly within the Republican Party, this further Ukraine funding and the idea of Ukraine being a forever war is very unpopular. But there wasn't a single Democrat who defected, and the mainstream media is still behind this, and the establishment Republicans or rhinos are also behind it, and so this funding is going to continue. And again, I think the thing you have to be really worried about is that if the war does not end, basically if Ukraine doesn't collapse before November and Biden wins re-election, what will he do in a second term? I don't think that Biden or Sullivan or Blinken are madmen. I don't think they want World War III. But nonetheless, there's a lot of people pressuring them, whether it's these European allies who are pressuring them, whether it's the media, whether it's kind of these hardliners in the Republican Party, who they'll be applying pressure to do something to save the Ukrainians. And once Biden is no longer at the mercy of voters, once he no longer has to worry about the next election, he's more free to do whatever is in his heart of hearts. And he is, again, very committed to this Ukrainian cause. And I don't know if he wants that. I don't think he wants that egg on his face. So I think there is a meaningful chance that Biden could allow himself to be kind of lured into, providing more assistance and specifically NATO, NATO boots on the ground.
Yeah, here's the big problem, or one of many big problems with it. In terms of this funding here, now, to much fanfare, right after this thing was passed, or right after Biden signed it, there was a release from the DoD where they said, here's the first tranche of $1 billion, and here's all these categories it's going to produce or provide. That some of this stuff is immediately on the way to reinforce the theme that now the stuff is flowing. Interestingly, they also didn't put the amount of any of this stuff. They just put the categories. But here's the news out today. U.S. is preparing to announce $6 billion in weapons contracts for Ukraine. So that's part of this deal. And it sounds good until you start to look at the fine print. It would include Patriot air defense munitions, artillery ammunition, drones, counter drones, weapons, and air-to-air missiles. Again, that all sounds great to be fit on fighter planes, according to officials. Which also includes ammunition for HIMARS and NASAM air defense systems, but likely won't arrive in Ukraine for several years as the money is being allocated under the Ukraine Assistance Initiative. It goes back to what you said at the beginning, that this is going to take a long lead time to get up. So even this $61 billion, there's almost nothing that's going to fundamentally go to them that's going to change this around in any kind of a time frame that could affect the outcome of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on that point on Patriots, my understanding is that Raytheon, which I think makes these Patriot interceptor missiles, only makes 500 of them a year, and surge capacity means that they increase that number to 600. So surge is just plus 20%. It goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, where our DIBs has become pathetic. I mean, it doesn't have a surge capacity. I mean, it takes years and years to ramp up this production. So, you're only producing, call it 500 to 600 of these interceptor missiles a year. The Russians are dropping, I mean, I think they've used something like, I think just last year, they dropped something like 8,000 bombs at least. I mean, that's like the order of magnitude. So just the order of magnitude here is just way off. And we have a lot of other needs for those Patriot interceptors. I mean, our ships, our troops in the Middle East that are exposed in Iraq and Syria need air defense. The Israelis need air defense. So there's a lot of competing needs for those weapons. We just don't have the air defense to give them. I mean, that's the bottom line. And it comes back to the fact that we just don't produce enough, and what little we do produce is too expensive. And until we sort all of this out through comprehensive reform of our DIB, I just think that America's, it's just in pretty poor shape to take on these types of security obligations. But of course, reforming these entrenched, reforming these oligopolies, these industries that also have immense lobbying power. This is just not something Washington is very good at, or that we've seen at all. So I just don't know how this is going to happen.
Yeah, and to me, this goes into something I was talking about in a different context earlier today, but it definitely is connected. Is that the United States has no strategic vision. We don't know what we want to accomplish, and so it has to do with, at the strategy level, is China, Taiwan / the Middle East, Europe, all these kind of things. We have to have a strategy for how our limited resources can be applied. We have great power, but it's not unlimited, and we have to see how that's going to work. And when you're talking about, trying to support a war in the Middle East, trying to support a war in Asia, in Europe, and maybe having to fight one in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific if things go sideways with China and Taiwan. And then you look at the defense industrial base. These things all have to be taken care of. And before we take any steps here that could get us sucked into something, David, if we got sucked into, whether it's in the Russia-Ukraine war or in the China, and you see our DIB is where the defense industrial base is what you just talked about. It can't even handle this. If we got into a war and had to sustain it, we don't have the capacity to do that. We're going to be in a real world of hurt if we get struggled into that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, one of the biggest problems in Washington and, among the political class and also the mainstream media is they still act as if we're in a unipolar world. They act as if America is the sole superpower and we can do whatever we want, and our abilities are unlimited. There's no constraints on our ability to produce weapons or spend money or our power, any of those things. And like Biden said, we're not just the most powerful country in the world, we're the most powerful country in the history of the world. We can do all these things. We can do Israel and Iran and the Middle East. We can do Ukraine. We can defend Taiwan. In fact, the whole statement behind this bill, this $95 billion bill, was a package that included Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan all at once. It was almost like a statement like, we can just do all these things. We don't need to make any trade-offs at all. And I mean, this is basically the mindset that people in Washington are trapped in. It's again, this unipolar mindset, and we're now in a multipolar world. And those other superpowers are figuring out that the U.S. is massively overstretched.
Yeah,
and at the same,
sorry.
No, I mean,
that's a real problem. And in fact, here's how Biden actually put that.
We don't walk away from our allies. We stand with them. We don't let tyrants win. We oppose them. We don't merely watch global events unfold. We shape them. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. That's what it means to be the world's superpower and the world's leading democracy. But this vote makes it clear there is a bipartisan consensus for that kind of American leadership. That's exactly what we'll continue to deliver.
If it was only bumper stickers, if it was only words, that would be very patriotic, and we probably have some flags waving in the background and patriotic music. But as you said, there is a real world here. It's a multipolar world, whether we want it or not. And we do have limitations, whether we want to admit it or not. But when that's the direction you're trying to go, I don't know, where does the reform come in? Because if you don't even recognize there's a problem, then you're not going to take any action. That's my real worry.
Yeah, I mean, Biden's speech there was like a greatest hits of all the neocon cliches over the last 30 years, or the indispensable nations. You got some Madeleine Albright, you sprinkle in some Dick Cheney, it's all kind of there. But the problem is we're not that nation anymore. I mean, like you and McGregor have talked about, we couldn't even do what we did in 1991 in that Gulf War. And I mean, our military is substantially degraded from that point. Certainly our DIB is, and there's other great powers now in the system. So yeah, I mean, look, but Biden's trapped in the past. I mean, I think this is the problem with having a president who has spent the last 50 years in Washington, is that kind of his brain got baked during this whole unipolar period, and he can't shake that type of thinking. Yeah. They're all kind of like that. I mean, Washington's kind of run by these octogenarians, and I don't think we're going to get any new thinking there without new leadership. I don't think it's a coincidence that the politicians who are thinking differently, like J.D. Vance or Thomas Massey or Rand Paul or Mike Lee, they are a different generation than than McConnell or Biden or Pelosi. Yeah. I mean, and one of the points that J.D. Vance made in his Senate speech is that in 2003, when he was graduating high school, he signed up for the Marines because he believed in that whole narrative that Saddam Hussein was the new Hitler and we had to go over there and stop him. And so he was gung-ho and signed up for that. And he kind of realized that whole 1938 narrative turned out to be basically a mirage. Yeah. And he's like, I'm not going to fall for that again. They keep telling us that it's always 1938. The enemy is always Hitler and diplomacy is always appeasement. And he's like, I've figured out that this is just kind of their playbook. This is kind of how they run things. But, JD figured it out because he was actually over there. And, so many of these other guys they've never updated their thinking.
Yeah. And I think that more and more Americans are coming around to that way of thinking. And like you say, they got the narrative basically captured with the major mainstream media. But I think because of, like your All In podcast, you're tweeting, shows like this one and some other people going on there, that they don't have control over that part of the narrative. And a lot more people are starting to look at these alternative things because they make sense. They match up with what you see on the ground, and this other stuff doesn't. We just have to hope that transition happens faster.
Yeah. No, I think collectively all the independent media is making a big difference. but it hasn't translated yet into a political change. But look, let me make a prediction, which is at some point here, if Ukraine doesn't collapse, they'll be back before the U.S. Congress for more funding. And if the Congress passes more funding, which probably they will, I don't think it's going to be done with the waving of flags and the chorus of cheers and all the hootering and hollering. I predict it'll be done in the middle of the night, right before the Christmas recess, maybe during a lame duck session, and the vote will be done quietly, and they'll sneak out of town. Because I do think that the popularity of this cause is waning significantly, and the American people are getting fatigued with it. And I don't think that this type of celebratory atmosphere is going to be received well. This video of them waving a foreign flag on the House floor, I think even by November, that's going to look really bad in campaign ads. So I think my guess is that the American people are going to have had enough of it by Christmas.
So let me ask you just one final question before we let you go. In the event that Biden doesn't win and Trump does, you said that you think that he supported that package out of tactical reasons, politically, and and how it was going to calculate to go into the election. If he wins, though, do you think that he would do anything different than Biden would in a second term?
Well, I think the advantage of Trump is that he has fresh eyes on this conflict, and he's not saddled with needing to defend all of Biden's previous decisions. And so you kind of reset everything. You're not in the grip of this sunk cost fallacy. And he's simply not as passionate about this, about Ukraine as Biden is. So the hope is you get a reset, and then, Trump can chart a new policy, as opposed to what Biden may well do in his second term, which is double down. It's hard for me to imagine Trump sending in troops, for example, under any circumstance. Yeah. Why would he want to take that on? And of course, Trump, in various interviews like that CNN town hall he did, where the moderator, Caitlin Clark, kept pressing him, whose side are you on? Are you on Ukraine's side? Are you on Putin's side? And Trump basically said, look, the side I'm on is I want people to stop dying. I love that, actually. Very definitely reframed that issue. And then there was a report that recently, when he met with Orban, that at least Orban said afterwards that Trump had told him that, he couldn't wait to turn off the spigot of Ukraine funding. But, who knows? I mean, Trump did different things at different times. I mean, I will say the only thing that concerns me a little bit about Trump is I think that his instincts are in the right place. I think that he wants to end the war. But his personnel choices have not always lined up with his own policy views or policy instincts. I mean, his first administration was chock full of neocons, like
John Bolton,
and Nikki Haley and Pompeo. Right. And there is a pretty strong rumor that Pompeo may be back as maybe Secretary of Defense. So, I get a little worried, not about Trump per se, but about the people who might be sitting around the table advising him. And I think this is why this VP pick is going to be very important. It's going to be a signal of the direction where Trump wants to lead the party.
Do you have any ideas who it might be? What's your guess?
Well, I don't know, but there's a pretty wide range of options to choose from. And I guess the point I'm making is that if he chooses a neocon, that's a pretty bad sign. On the other hand, if he chooses somebody whose policy instincts are more in line with his own, which is clearly what I think he should do, then I'll feel a lot better about, let's say, a personnel upgrade in the second term.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope we see that, and I'll be watching with great interest on that too, because I think that will be a huge signal to who he's going to get. Because hopefully, whoever that person could be could maybe help with the personnel issues in the staffing. Although I know there's some people behind the scenes working on that. Just remains to be seen if that translates, if he ends up winning, but we'll see. But listen, thank you so much for coming on today and giving us so much of your time, David. Really appreciate this. Definitely keep up the good work on Twitter and keep taking these nonsense on, and we'll keep echoing it here too. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Danny. Good to see you.
And thank you very much for showing up today. We always value you because, after all, folks, we're all in this together. We're going to keep bringing you quality stuff like this so that you can see that you're not alone in how you think. And we're all going to continue to go forward with this. We're going to remain unintimidated and uncompromised about bringing you the truth, even if it's something that people don't like anytime. And we ask you to like and subscribe and share this with your friends. And we will see you next week on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.